Welcome. I'm Jane Partridge, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. And the League is very pleased that we're partnering tonight with AAUW, American Association of University Women, and the Senior Center. Let me remind you that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we influence public policy through education and advocacy. Membership in the League is open to both men and women of all ages. There are membership brochures and newsletters on the sign-in table. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or any board member. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me give you a little information about some of our other activities. We have another interesting program scheduled for next month and hope you will attend. We will have a panel discussion with Ralph Martiri, Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, Kathy Rigg, our former state representative and now president of Voices of Illinois Children, and Christy Long, president of United Way of Lake County. They will discuss the impact of our state's economic crisis on our children and communities. The program will be held Sunday, April 10th at 2 o'clock. We will be sending out more information in our monthly email alert, or there will be information on our website, which is www.lflb.org. We also have produced a video voter guide for the upcoming school board elections. There is a short 5-minute presentation by each of the 12 candidates running for the 3 different school boards in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. The video can be seen on Lake Forest TV or on our website. That's channel 17 or 19. Tonight, I'm really happy to introduce our speaker, Professor Cole. I heard him a year and a half ago, and I was very excited because not only is he a Cuban, but he keeps up on things and he speaks in a way you can ask him questions and save your questions till the end because he's still very much involved with what is going on in Cuba. He was born in Cuba and came to the United States when he was 13 without his parents and went on to graduate cum laude from Princeton University. He later earned his Juris Doctor and PhD from the University of Virginia. Dr. Cole was chairman of the Strategic Research Department of the U.S. Naval War College before joining DePaul University Law School. He has not only taught extensively, but also served in government. One of his positions was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, where he oversaw the Defense Department's work in Special Operation Forces and, quote, low-intensity conflict. For his work, he received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. Dr. Cole has written numerous articles on international relations and the law, and is the author of the book, The Wisdom of Statecraft. He is a leading scholar in policies regarding world affairs. Please welcome Dr. Cole.
Yes. So you can just stick it in a pocket and on a belt. I think you might just stick it in your pocket.
Oh, just a pocket.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And then you can just this.
Thank you.
Should be good, I think.
So I guess this goes like this.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Partridge, for your very kind words. I am delighted to be here with you this evening. It is always fun to speak about Cuba, and I want to do a number of things. One is talk about Cuba today, what is happening in Cuba, and then talk a little bit about U.S. policy towards Cuba and the impact that it might or might not have on Cuban developments. And then, of course, I want to open the floor to questions early on, because I think that's where a lot of your interest is going to be, to discuss very specific questions you have about Cuba. First of all, the first question that always comes to mind is, why should we care about Cuba? You know, Cuba is a small island. You can see it here in this wonderful map that you put together. Small island, 11 million people, very small country. It's 90 miles from the United States. Why? Why are we so fascinated with Cuba? Why is it so interesting to us? Obviously, the fact that it is only 90 miles from us has an impact. And also, of course, if you look at it, it is right in the heart of the Caribbean. In fact, throughout history, Cuba has been known as the key to the Caribbean because of its strategic location. You know, you cannot go to Mexico, you cannot go to Texas by sea, you cannot go to Central America without running into Cuba, without having to go through Cuba. And the fact that it is so strategically located means that the United States for hundreds of years has considered Cuba very important. As early as the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, 200 years ago, the United States government, President Jefferson, talked about the desirability of eventually acquiring Cuba from Spain. And in fact, a number of American presidents during the early years of the Republic tried to acquire Cuba. Early on in his presidency, John Quincy Adams talked about Cuba as a ripe apple that would eventually fall into our hands. And a number of presidents right before the Civil War tried to purchase Cuba from Spain. And the reason those efforts failed, especially in the 1840s and 50s, is that in New England, there were lots of people who were opposed to the idea of Cuba coming into the United States because they believed, rightly so, that Cuba would become another slaveholding state, that it would add to the power of the South, and they did not want that. So a lot of Southerners wanted to bring Cuba in as a slaveholding state. A lot of people north of the Mason-Dixon line opposed those moves. And as you know, in the second half of the 19th century, in the 1860s and later on the 1890s, the Cubans tried to gain their independence from Spain, and they fought two very bloody wars to achieve that. And finally, in 1898, the United States entered that war, and we know it in our textbooks as the Spanish-American War. But in Cuba, in 1940, in fact, long before Castro came to power, the Cuban government passed a law saying, we shall not speak in this country of the Spanish-American War. We shall always refer to it as the Cuban-Spanish-American War, because Cubans felt that this was a war they had been fighting with Spain, and then the United States came in and became a part of it, but they thought they should, the name Cuba should be part of it. And Spain was quickly defeated in that war once the United States entered, and the United States occupied the island, okay, and said, okay, now we're the occupying power, and there were people in Congress who wanted to annex Cuba and turn it into something like Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory that eventually might become an associated state or not. But a number of other people in Congress were opposed to that idea. Some of them, frankly, on racial grounds, as shocking as that may sound. There was a large minority at that time of people in Cuba of African descent. And people in Congress, there were people in Congress who did not want Cuba coming into the Union, bringing all those black people. Basically, that's how the debate went in some cases. In other cases, the feeling was that Cuba was not ready to be part of the Union, that Cuba did not have a democratic culture. It had been run by Spain in a very centralized fashion. So at the end of it, the United States government proposed to the Cubans a deal. And the deal was this. They said, we will allow you to become an independent country on 2 conditions. Okay? Number 1, you have to give us a long-term lease, okay, in Guantanamo. Okay? And this will be a naval base and a coaling station. And the lease was written in such a way that it's not called an indefinite lease, but it's written in such a way that for the lease to be terminated, both parties have to agree. Okay, it's a good deal, you know. So if the United States never agrees to it, we don't have to give up that lease. The second requirement for the Cubans to gain their independence, and that was the one that was the most humiliating to Cuba, was what was known as the Platt Amendment, which was sponsored by Senator Orville Platt of Connecticut. And it was that the Cubans had to accept that the United States had the right to intervene militarily in Cuba anytime the United States deemed it in its interests. And, you know, that was very humiliating because they felt, hey, we want to be an independent country. We don't want to give anybody the right to intervene militarily whenever they want to. But the Cubans signed on the dotted line, and that's how Cuba became independent in 1902. For the following 50 years, Cuban history was fairly turbulent. There was a succession of governments, some of them democratic, others dictatorial. The country prospered economically, okay? And the key to Cuba's history up until very recently has been something that everybody in the world loves. What is it? Sugar, exactly. You know, everybody loves sugar. And for some strange reason, okay, Cuba's soil and climate is just perfect for sugarcane, okay? And so, how many of you have been to Havana? All right? How many of you would like to go to Havana? Okay? Write to President Obama, okay? When you get home, okay? If you've been to Havana, when you go to Havana, you will see all these magnificent buildings everywhere. A lot of them in very dilapidated condition today, but lots of beautiful homes and palaces and buildings. And you say, how could this little country of 11 million people have this wonderful architecture? It's all sugar money, okay? It was all built on sugar money. And Cuba did very well during the 2 world wars in the 20th century. First World War, the Second World War, there was a huge demand for sugar. And believe it or not, back in those days, there were a number of European countries that were sugar producers. They produced sugar from beet. And of course, their economies were put out of commission during the wars. And there was a lot of demand by the fighting armies for sugar. So Cuba prospered. And that's the money that you see in these beautiful buildings. There's a great book that you would have a lot of fun reading, which has a lot about Cuban history, Cuban politics, and it's called The Sugar King. Any of you have seen it? Okay. Look it up on Amazon.com. When you get home, you will love reading it. It's called The Last Sugar King. Okay? And it's about Julio Lobo, who was born in 1898, died in 1980, and he was the world's most powerful sugar broker. Okay? And as a little boy, I used to go to his home, which had been turned into a museum by Castro. And Julio Lobo had the largest collection of Napoleonic memorabilia outside France. Okay? In fact, his fortune was estimated when he left Cuba in 1960 to go into exile at $200 million at that time, which in today's dollars would be equivalent to about $5 billion. Okay? He was the most powerful sugar broker in the world, Julio Lobo, and this book tells his amazing story. Now, in 1959, Fidel Castro came to power riding what was essentially a middle-class revolution. It was not a communist revolution, it was a middle-class revolution, and I know that very well because my father supported it. Okay? Now, my mother never liked Castro. My mother went to law school with him. She graduated from the law school at the University of Havana in 1947. Not many Cuban women at that time, or American women for that matter, were law school graduates. But my mother met Castro in law school. She's still living, God bless her. It's a very sharp mind. And she never liked him. She thought that he was too egotistical. But my father was a young, idealistic person, and he believed Castro's promises about an honest revolution, and he sold bonds for Castro while Castro was fighting his guerrilla war here in Santiago in the Sierra Maestra. And then after Castro seized power, my father, like many other middle-class Cubans, became very disillusioned with Castro. And he joined a movement to overthrow Castro. And eventually my father was arrested, and he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Some of his friends wound up with 20 years in prison, 15 years in prison. And there were 3 of them in that whole movement that were supposed to be executed by firing squad. And at the last minute, the president of Mexico called Castro and appealed for mercy, and their sentences were commuted from death to 30 years in prison. So I grew up during the Cuban Revolution. My father was in prison as a political prisoner. My mother was a lawyer, and she supported the family. And I can tell you that it was a very unsettling time, and a time also in which a lot of people in Cuba still liked Castro, and they had this great dream of building a truly egalitarian society. And sometime around 1961, you know the history, the United States, the CIA, President Eisenhower organized a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. They failed spectacularly at the Bay of Pigs. Bobby Kennedy ordered the CIA to try harder, and they attempted several hundred assassination plots against Castro, all of which failed spectacularly. One of my favorite ones involved a very beautiful woman who's still living in Miami Beach, and a friend of mine knew her father, and she met Castro in 1960 on a cruise ship in Havana, and Castro fell madly in love with her, and a couple of months later she came to the US and the CIA recruited her. And they said, "We want you to assassinate him." And she said, "I will do that. I will do that, because my family doesn't like him." So she went back to Havana and called Fidel, and Fidel said, "It's so good to see you." And she said, "Fidel, I really want to see you again." So he met her, he took her to the penthouse of the Havana Hilton Hotel, which today is called the Havana Libre, but it's a beautiful hotel, finished in 1957. And they made passionate love, also she tells in her story, at the penthouse of the Havana Hilton. And then he showed her the view of Havana Harbor, and then she said, "Fidel, let's have a drink. I'm going to bring you a drink." And so she went, and she had her little pills that the CIA had given her, poison, to give to Fidel, and she brings the drinks, and Fidel, I think, figured out what she was up to. So Fidel takes his gun, and he gives it to her. And he says, "Okay, if you've come to kill me, do it right. Shoot me." And she says in her memoir, she just fell apart. She couldn't do it. And she just fell apart, and she left Cuba. And that was the end of that particular effort to get rid of Fidel. So anyway, now this was 50 years ago, of course, and we also know that sometime in 1961, Cuba started becoming very close to the Soviet Union, and Fidel talked with Khrushchev about placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, Soviet intermediate range nuclear missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy found out about it a few months later in September of 1962, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many of you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? All right. I was a very young boy at the time, and I was in Cuba. And I tell you, we really felt that this was going to be a very serious thing, okay? And that we were going to be in the middle of a war with the United States, the Soviet Union, Castro, everybody, and we were going to get the bombs on our heads. And of course, the world came very close to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was settled. It was a spectacular triumph of diplomacy and of reasonableness. But for the following, pretty much for the following 30 years, Cuba became very much of a Soviet-style European, Eastern European state. Okay? And Cuba became inserted into this economic sphere that was part of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the United States just reached very much of a point where we kept the embargo on, a very tight trade embargo on Cuba, and we thought if we keep this embargo against Cuba long enough, it will cause Castro to collapse. Okay? And of course it didn't work. And there were a couple of American presidents who tried to change our relationship with Cuba. Gerald Ford in the mid-70s, Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s actually went very far towards reestablishing some kind of relationship with Cuba. But when President Ronald Reagan came into the White House, he rolled back all those efforts, and our policy towards Cuba, unlike our policy towards other communist countries at that time, became one of isolation, okay? And one of putting a lot of pressure. So there's something very ironical that you need to ask yourself. Why was it that in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were promoting travel to Eastern Europe, human contacts with the Soviet Union, as a way of kind of softening those regimes, undermining them in a devious way? But towards Cuba, our policy was one of isolation. And that's the way it was when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay? 1989, 1990, President Gorbachev said no more subsidies to Cuba. The Cuban economy relied on $5 billion a year worth of Soviet subsidies. That's a lot of money for, back then especially, for a small Caribbean island of 11 million people. And I was at the Pentagon when all this happened. And I remember, you know, as a Cuban, I was concerned about this, so I went to see Paul Wolfowitz, who later served President Bush Jr., George W., as Deputy Secretary of Defense. I was in the George H.W. Bush administration, George Bush Sr. And I went to see Paul Wolfowitz, and I said, you know, Mr. Wolfowitz, this may be a good time to reassess our Cuba policy. I said, by then it was 1990, 1991. I said, you know, the Soviet Union had withdrawn its subsidies from Cuba. This may be a good time for us to ask whether this Cold War policy makes any sense. And he thought about it for a while, and he came back with a brilliant, spectacularly wrong answer. Okay? And Mr. Wolfowitz is a brilliant man, he's a very thoughtful man, but as he showed later in Iraq, sometimes he can be spectacularly wrong. And his answer, deceptively brilliant, but utterly wrong, was, now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, the embargo will finally work. Makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, logically. Now it will work because the Cuban government won't have anybody to turn to. So this is the time to keep pushing on this policy that hasn't worked, but this time it'll work because Cuba won't have anybody to turn to. That's exactly what happened. In 1992, the Congress tightened up the sanctions against Cuba, and then, of course, in 1996, it did that again with the Helms-Burton Law. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, Castro did not collapse. Okay? and Cuba went into a pronounced economic crisis. I mean, Cuban gross domestic product shrank by 35% from 1989 to 1995. Okay? This was more than the U.S. gross domestic product shrank during the Great Depression, which was about 25%. Their GDP shrank by 35%. And it was a major crisis, and Castro said, we are going through a special period of austerity. And as a result of that crisis, okay, the Castro government did two important things that were very significant. Number one, they said, we're going to start allowing foreign investors. You see, until that time, foreign investment was a dirty word in Cuba. Foreign investment was associated with the old capitalists who came to our country and raped our property and exploited our resources. Now, all of a sudden, foreign investors were considered people who were very useful because they brought capital, know-how, and new ideas. So the Cuban economy started opening up to foreign investment. And then secondly, Castro said, we're going to allow some small-level private enterprise. And we're even going to allow more farming activity, more agricultural activity by small farmers. So those were two changes, and believe it or not, they were sufficient that they kept the Cuban economy from totally collapsing, okay? And so by the time President George W. Bush came into office in the year 2000, the Cuban economy had not collapsed, okay? And of course, you may know this or you may not know this, but the reason that George W. Bush won the election was the famous Florida electoral battle, okay? And to the extent that you believe that there was a majority of people in Florida who voted for George W. Bush, and I think the official count was 536 votes that he got over Al Gore after discounting all the chads and all the defective ballots. The administration believed that they had won Florida and that they had won the White House because of the Cuban-American vote. Because there were many Cuban-American hardliners who took sides with the Republican Party and decided to support a more tough policy on Cuba. And George W. Bush said, I will deliver on my promise, we will have a tougher policy towards Cuba. And roughly from 2001 till 2008, the Bush administration tightened the screws considerably on Cuba. And the goal was to cause the Cuban government to collapse, okay? And of course, they failed there too. But in 2006, in August of 2006, Fidel Castro became very ill, okay? And he almost died, I mean, literally, and we know now what happened. He had a terrible case of diverticulitis, okay, which he had not taken care of properly, and literally his intestines burst, okay? And he was on a flight coming back from Oriente to Havana, okay? From here he was flying, and he nearly bled to death, okay? And he required massive surgery, and then the doctors, took a huge piece of his colon, of his intestines, they took it out, and they said, now, Mr. Castro, you're going to need, for a while, a colostomy, okay? You all know what a colostomy is, okay? You're going to need a colostomy so that all that surgery and all that tissue can recover, okay? Well, Fidel, being very much of an old-fashioned macho, said, I don't want a colostomy. I don't want to walk around with a little bag. Don't give me one, okay? All right, so his doctors obeyed him, and because of that, his whole system was gradually poisoned, okay, by all kinds of toxic fluid from the surgery, and he literally almost died, okay? And that's when he came the closest to death. And people were speculating he had cancer. He just had a very bad case of diverticulitis, which required massive surgery, and which, because of his famous stubbornness, became deadly when he refused a colostomy. So, of course, he resigned from office, and his brother Raul, who is young, only 76, back then. Now he's, Raul Castro is 80, Fidel is 85, okay, same age as my mom. And Raul became president, and then later on, he became the official president of the country, okay? And to this day, Fidel Castro is retired. I mean, he literally is retired. He continues to write articles. Occasionally he meets with people. He has a lot of influence politically, okay? But the man who is running the country is his brother, and has been running the country for the last 4 years. That's his brother, okay? Now, Raul Castro has faced a very clear problem, and that is Cuba is utterly bankrupt, okay? It's bankrupt. Why is it bankrupt? Okay, 25% of the reason is the U.S. embargo. 75% of the reason is because socialist economics doesn't work, okay? Because basically, and by socialist economics, I don't mean Swedish economics, or I don't mean social democratic economics of the type you might have in Norway or Canada. I'm talking about, you know, old Soviet-style socialism. The problem with the Cuban economy is simple. People don't have enough incentives to produce, okay? So, for example, you know, Cuba has rich farmland, and it's a tropical country. There are things they could never produce. They cannot produce wheat, okay, or apples, okay. Those are, their soil would not do that. But they could produce enough food to feed themselves. However, Cuba imports a huge amount of food, some of it from Illinois farmers, which is good for all of us, okay. And why? Because farmers don't have enough incentives to grow food, okay. And the country is literally bankrupt because of a very inefficient economic system, okay. So Raul is not as ideological, not as much of a visionary as his brother. He's more of a pragmatic guy. You know, a few years ago he gave a very famous speech. This was even before the current crisis, in which he said, what we need in this country is more beans and fewer bullets, okay. It's a nice rhyme there, beans and bullets, BB, okay. More beans and fewer bullets. He's very pragmatic. So Raul Castro right now is gradually embarking on a process based on what you might call the Chinese or Vietnamese model. What he would like to do is open up the Cuban economy more to the private sector. Their goal is within the next 4 years to have 50% of the workforce transfer over to the private sector, so that 50% of the workforce would be employed in the private sector, okay? To increase foreign investment, and to allow, therefore, the economy to start growing while retaining political control. See, that's the Chinese model, okay? You have the Communist Party open up the economy, and also the Vietnamese model. You open up the economy, you allow private economic activity, people start prospering, they feel better, and the Communist Party, it's called Communist Party, but there's nothing really communist about it. How many of you have been to China? It's the most capitalistic society in the world. I mean, it's got a Communist Party, it's a repressive country politically, but what most Chinese are interested in doing is making lots of money. You know, Deng Xiaoping put it very famously. There is nothing wrong with getting rich. In fact, it's a very good thing to get rich, he said. Okay? So that's the model Raul Castro would like to follow. Okay? Now, I was in Cuba this December. I went with a group of Illinois judges and lawyers, including a Supreme Court justice from Illinois. And we met with a brilliant young economist that I met 10 years ago in Cuba. And his name is Omar Everlani. And at that time, 10 years ago, Omar Everlani was writing these papers saying what the Cuban economy needs is more incentive. And we need to reform. And we can do that without becoming a purely capitalist society, but we have to provide incentives for people, and we have to allow people to make money so that they will work harder and produce more, okay? And everybody will benefit. And nobody was paying much attention to him at that time, okay? Well, today, he is a close advisor to Raul Castro. And he gave us a briefing, gave our group a briefing, and he laid it all out. He said, this is what our strategy is going to be. Now, here's the catch, okay? To get there, okay, think about it, okay? The Cuban economy today, most of the workers are in the public sector, okay? And they are in these very inefficient enterprises that don't produce much, okay? So the government has said to start this transition towards a more free market economy, we're going to have to lay off 500,000 people this year and 500,000 people next year. It's a lot of people. In a country of 11 million people, you're going to have to lay off 10% of the workforce, okay? Higher percentage of the workforce, actually. But 10% of the population is going to have to lose their jobs. Okay, what are you going to do with them? They will find new jobs. Where? Well, the government will liberalize the economy so that it will allow new forms of private enterprise that until last year were not allowed to exist. Great. Sounds good, right? So you fire people from their public sector jobs, they go into the private sector and start new businesses, small businesses. What's wrong with that picture? They don't know how to do it. Exactly. A lot of them don't. There are always going to be a few who do, okay? And even if that could work, it'll take years, okay? But I mean, think of it typically, somebody, so I asked Dr. Overlaney, I said, well, how do you decide who you fire? He said, well, obviously you don't want to fire the best people, right? Okay? So he said, in every enterprise you will have a council, okay? People will get together and they will vote by secret ballot, and you say, okay, we got to fire 10 people here. So write on a secret ballot who are the 10 people you want to fire, okay? Well, who's going to get fired? The lazy, okay? The troublemakers, the people who are difficult to get along with, the prima donnas, okay? Those are going to get fired. Are those people going to go out next week and start new business? Are they going to start hustling, trying to create new enterprises? Not so fast, okay? Not so fast. So they've got this problem, okay? It's a very serious problem. They know where they want to go, okay? They want to have a freer economy. They want to have a more productive economy. And they want to move into the direction of Vietnam. You know, Vietnam has been doing very well over the last 20 years, okay? And if you had invested, for example, in the Vietnamese stock market 10 years ago, you would have done very well. And even if you're not a stock investor, you know, over the last 10 years, Vietnam has cut its poverty rate in half, okay? Half. That poverty rate was cut in half. And it was done all because of economic growth generated by the shift, okay, to allow more private enterprise. But it's still a communist country in the sense it's still a one-party state, okay? And you cannot stand in a corner with a placard saying, down with the party, okay? You get in trouble. But people, right now, the Vietnamese don't mind that because their material conditions are improving. And so they say, well, fine, I will have a good private life. I'll try to make more money, feed my family, take care of them, and we will leave politics maybe for the next generation. That's what the Cuban government would like to do, but what I'm saying to you, it's going to be hard to get there. Okay? Okay, in the meantime, what is the US government doing? Well, not a whole lot. Okay? And there's a problem with that, which is that if you think about it, we should be encouraging that process. Okay? And one way to encourage that process would be to end the embargo, or at least to relax it, so that more Americans would travel to Cuba. It's a beautiful country, stunningly beautiful, you know. I look at this map and I have all these wonderful memories, you know. If you were to take the road here from Havana and go east, okay? Look at these keys here. Do you see these keys here? Okay? See them on the map really well, okay? These keys. These are just incredible. You've never been in a key like that, I assure you. The Bahamas are like Miami Beach compared to these keys, okay? In other words, These keys are virgin, okay? You might have a hotel every 4, 5, 6 miles, okay? Beautiful. The country is very green and has a lot of potential, okay? We could be allowing lots of Americans who want to, whoever wants to go to Cuba, we could allow American companies, if they want to take risks, go to Cuba. After all, you know, Cuba has invited a number of foreign companies to come in and do business. We could be doing that. Who is Cuba's natural trading and economic partner? We are. 300 million market, okay, for Cuban cigars, for Cuban sugar, okay? Only 11 million of them, okay? And it would have a very healthy effect on their society in a good direction. We're not doing that. President Obama has been very cautious. He has taken a couple of positive steps. Basically, he's taken U.S. policy back to where it was during President Clinton's presidency, to 1998. So he has erased the George W. Bush restrictions. Cuban Americans now are able to go freely. They can send as much money as they want there. And recently, the president liberalized the rules 2 months ago so that American churches, synagogues, museums, groups of Americans can go much more easily. So, you know, you could organize a group. Your League of Women Voters could organize a trip to Cuba. You'd have no trouble getting subscriptions, okay? And you could get a license from the U.S. government, which probably you would not have under President George W. Bush. But those are very small steps. So in closing, what I want to say is that there is this very close history between these two countries, and we do sense that what happens in Cuba is important. I mean, the last thing we want Cuba to do is to suffer a gradual breakdown. I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios I could think of that keep me awake at night. For example, Fidel Castro might die. He will die, as William Buckley famously said. Someday, Castro will probably die. All right, and and then there's a very caustic remark. How many of you like Rockefeller 3D? 3D Rock? It's a TV. 30 Rock, yeah, 30 Rock. Okay. You can't see I don't watch it that much, but I watch it once in a while. I just happened to turn it one night, and there is Alec Baldwin, you know, and he has this very troubled relationship with his mother, and his mother is very elderly but very strong and very feisty, and he hangs up the phone and he says, "She's just like Castro. She never dies." Anyway, but here's a scenario to think about, to worry about. Castro dies, and then Raul may die in a couple of years after his brother, or Raul may die before his brother does, Fidel. And the country starts disintegrating, okay? And right now, you know, the military would kind of step in with a party, and they would try to hold the country together. Cuba is in a perfect position to become a magnificent entrepreneurial center for illegal drug cartels and for organized crime, okay? Look at where it is. Okay? And so far, I mean, Cuba, because of the government's control, is free of drugs, and is also free from the drug trade. Okay? Drug traders do not use Cuba. So you could have a gradual deterioration into which Cuba slowly becomes a failed state with rising levels of crime, poverty, drug use, drug trade. We don't want that 90 miles from our shores. Okay? So what we want is a Cuba that gradually becomes more prosperous, and then that gradually over time becomes more open, more pluralistic, and eventually more democratic. To do that, we have to be engaged. We cannot stay on the sidelines. So I will stop there, and then I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, and we'll have a lot of fun with them. So please, the floor is yours.
Just raise your hand.
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Venezuela was supplying them with their oil.
Yes.
And Cuba was supplying them with doctors.
Yes. Yes. That's a very interesting relationship. Right now, the single most important assistance that the Cuban economy receives is Venezuelan oil at subsidized prices. Basically, what the relationship is like this. Cuba has several thousand doctors and sports trainers in Venezuela, okay? And these people are working in the slums, in places where Venezuelan middle-class doctors don't want to go, and where nice Venezuelan middle-class sports trainers don't want to go. So you have several thousand, as many as 10,000 Cuban doctors. But by the way, one of the remarkable things about Cuba, it's a weird country in many ways, and it has all these contradictions that make it difficult to understand from the outside. For example, you've all heard about the Cuban healthcare system, okay? It is actually, for Latin American standards, very good healthcare system. People get free healthcare, and the level of attention is very good, and of medical expertise is very good. Now, the country also has a lot of shortages, so if you have to have a surgery, you're going to get a free surgery, and you are going to be treated by a very good doctor, very well-trained doctor, very conscientious. You're also going to need your wife to take the bed sheets and towels to the hospital, because the hospitals, a lot of hospitals don't have bed sheets and towels, okay? So patients take the bed sheets and towels with them. But you will get a free surgery by a very capable doctor, okay? And so there is this contradiction, but the other thing that Cuba is very good at, they produce great doctors, great baseball players, of course, great dancers, great ballet dancers, great artists, very creative people, and of course, great sports trainers. For a little country like Cuba, they do very well in all kinds of international sports competitions. So Cuba sends about 10,000 doctors and trainers to Venezuela, and they give Venezuela an annual bill for that. They say, here's what these services cost you. It's a lot of money. And then Venezuela says, okay, here's how we will pay you for these services. We're not going to give you free oil, but we're going to give you oil at very subsidized prices. So it works for both of them, but it's problematical. Okay? Yes, please.
Seems to me that your model of the inefficient workers getting fired, can a worker quit? Can the sharp workers
Yes.
quit because
Absolutely.
more investors are coming in,
Absolutely.
starting businesses? It would be a wonderful opportunity.
Absolutely.
For top guys.
Absolutely. And that's what will happen, but for that to happen, it will take time. I mean, that's what will happen, that the really sharp workers at the state enterprises, they're going to be the ones who are going to quit, okay? Because they're going to say, I can make more money, or I can start a small business and make more money, even without working with foreign enterprise. I can make more money. So, and then the less capable people might stay in the state enterprises or not. But it will happen, but it's going to take time. And my point is, their plan to have 500,000 people fired 1 year and then the next year another 500,000 people is too ambitious. I had a wonderful experience in Havana when I was there in December. I stayed at this beautiful Hotel Nacional. Some of you may have seen it. If you've been to the Biltmore in Coral Gables or the Breakers in Palm Beach, it looks exactly like that. It was built somewhere in the late 1920s, beautiful hotel. And I had a very nice waiter that I struck up a friendship with. He must have been about 60 years old. And he said, I'm very excited. I said, well, what are you so excited about? He said, I am going to open up my own cafeteria. He said, it's gonna, in a month, it's going to be ready to open. I said, wow. I said, what do you? He said, well, I got it all figured out. He said, my wife will run it. And for now, and I will stay at this job here at the Hotel Nacional because, he gets good tips. But eventually, if there's enough business, then I'll quit this job and run my own cafeteria. I said, well, how did you get the money to do this? He said, well, I had a very old 1952 Chevy that was in great shape. I had taken very good care of it. So I sold it, and I got enough money so that I spent it on paint, equipment, and to get this cafeteria ready to go. And I thought, this is a microcosm of the Cuba of the future, okay? You got entrepreneurial. This man is 60 years old, okay? How many people in America are starting businesses when they're 60 years old? Some, but not a whole lot. And in Cuba, it's the same way. But he's got that fire. He sees the opportunity. The government is liberalizing its policy. He's going to jump in there. He's starting his own cafeteria, and he counts on making more money. Now, if American tourists were allowed to go to Cuba, you could see what would happen, okay? A number of us would wind up strolling down the street using his cafeteria. He would receive the money. He could reinvest it. One of the things about the new law that's important is that for the first time in 50 years, Cubans will be allowed to hire other Cubans. See, this was in orthodox Marxist economics, that's the greatest sin. You cannot hire people, you cannot pay people because that means you're exploiting them. Under the new law, you can hire people as long as you are able to afford paying their Social Security taxes, which is fair enough. We do that in this country too. So it was just an example of what could happen. Yes, ma'am.
When I was there 7 years ago, we stayed in beautiful joint venture hotels.
Yes.
That were built from people from the Netherlands or from Canada or from Spain.
Right.
And we were able to eat in some private home.
Yes.
Now I understand that there was a period of time when that was kind of disallowed.
Yes.
Not being allowed.
Absolutely. That's all come back roaring over the past year. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Paladares, the restaurant, these are family-owned restaurants. And now, again, the difference is they'll be able to hire people. You see, when you were there, they were only family, because you couldn't hire people, so you had to have your sister, your cousin working with you. Okay, you slip money under the table, but it was a family business. Now you can hire people and pay them. Yes, sir.
Well, a couple points there. Quick, are they getting any more cars, or is it still a museum for 1950 American automobiles?
They're getting a lot of cars, you know. Basically, in Cuba, if you have enough money, you can buy anything you want, okay? Now, only a few people make the money, you know. But you know, a lot of European cars, Japanese cars. The American cars are, of course, stunning. And Cubans, by the way, are not dumb. They know what they're worth. And you know, I've had friends, very clever friends, who've tried to bargain and say, "Hey, I'll buy your car," and say, "No, are you crazy? I know what the real value of this thing is worth. $50,000, not $5,000 like you wanted to pay me."
Where's the Bay of Pigs?
The Bay of Pigs is right here, right here.
I thought, all right, the central.
Yeah, I've been there. Beautiful beaches, very beautiful. Some of the most beautiful beaches. Cuba has about 1,000 miles of beautiful beaches. You think about it, you see this little island, but all around it, it's full of these about 1,000 miles worth of beautiful beaches. And 90% of them, virgin. Incredible. Yes, sir.
You think there's a chance that Cuba will ever have protests like going on in Africa?
Great question. Great question. Absolutely. The answer is yes. Right now, not yet, because not enough Cubans have access to the internet. Okay? So it's very difficult for a Cuban to get into Facebook. By the way, one of the things that Raul Castro did 2 years ago, he lifted restrictions on owning cell phones. So Cubans can own cell phones now. Of course, they have to buy them, and they're expensive. You know, for an average Cuban, it's expensive to have a cell phone. But you know, over time, I think that will change. Cuba, just now, okay, it's great you asked that question, because Cuba was having troubles getting enough bandwidth for the internet because of the United States embargo. Okay, so Chavez said, okay, I will build a cable that will link Cuba to the rest of the world from Venezuela through Jamaica. Okay, so this new cable, and the cable was just laid. Okay, they just finished laying this cable, and it goes all the way from Venezuela through Jamaica to Cuba. That means Cuba now will have huge bandwidth, huge connectivity to the rest of the world. The problem is the Cuban government still controls who in the island can actually go on the internet. Okay? So, and as long as they do that, it's going to be hard for people to organize the way they've done in Egypt, for example. But, you know, I think it's, things can happen. I think a lot of people in Cuba, if you talk with them, okay, they're very tired of the way things are. And it's, what bothers them the most is just the economic stagnation, you know. More than whether or not they can vote in free elections, more of whether they can stand up in a corner and say, down with Fidel. It's more the sense of economic stagnation. The country is stuck. And a lot of the young people in Cuba want to leave the country. And again, they don't want to leave for political reasons. They want to leave because they want to have a better economic future. And they can't find good jobs on the island. And that's going to catch up with them sooner or later. Yes, please.
Relative to the United States and Cuba, Castro dies, Raul dies, what happened? What's the best case scenario?
Oh, the best case scenario.
What would have to happen?
Okay. The best case scenario is one in which, I mean, first Fidel is going to have to die, okay, because he still has, again, he still has a lot of influence, especially with the armed forces. And that Raul dies. Then you're going to have probably a collective leadership, okay, like a board, a group of people. You know, the Soviet Union had that after Stalin died, and it had that after Khrushchev, okay, for a while. So you could have a collective leadership, 3 or 4 key figures, 1 or 2 from the military. You need the armed forces on board, and a couple of other people. And they would hold the system together, but their problem is going to be that to the extent that they succeed in their economic reforms, okay, then Cubans' expectations will increase, okay, and B, you're going to have greater connectivity to the rest of the world, and Cubans are going to say, hey, we want to be like the rest of the world. We don't, you know, we want to be like Egypt, for goodness sake. We want to be like Libya wants to be, okay? So, and without the Castro brothers around, I think the whole system will crumble, and the best scenario would be one in which you'd have like a peaceful revolution out of nowhere one day, and the regime just collapses and they open up.
Well, after Franco in Spain, you look at how that sort of evolved.
Very different, though, because remember what Franco did, okay? He was a wise dictator in the sense that he said, when I die, Prince Juan Carlos will become the constitutional monarch. And so when he died, he became a monarch. And then Juan Carlos said, okay, let's open up the country. Let's have a constitutional monarchy. You're not going to have that in Cuba. There's not going to be anybody with the prestige to be able to carry that role.
Is there any chance we'll see elections?
Well, eventually we will. I mean, eventually Cuba will become democratic, because this is what is so stupid about our policy, you see. They're only 90 miles from the United States. Moreover, Cubans are some of the most literate people in the world. I mean, almost everybody in Cuba, 99.9% of Cubans read and write, okay? And even though the government controls the media and all that, they know what's happening in the world, okay? And they want to be part of the world, okay? And so eventually that will happen. If we ended the embargo, which sadly we're not going to do in the next few years because of the power of this very extremist lobby in Congress. If we drop the embargo, the process would be accelerated. You would have Americans going to Cuba. You would have trade with the United States. You would have investment. This small, closed society would not be able to withstand that. Eventually, American ideas, American capital would undermine slowly. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it would accelerate the process of breaking this thing down. Authoritarian regimes cannot tolerate oxygen, okay? What the embargo is doing is it's keeping us isolated from Cuba, okay? And it's keeping the largest country in the region, 300 million strong, with the largest economy in the world, isolated from Cuba, keeping us from using our influence there. Somebody who hasn't, yes, please.
Two things. We spent some time in the International Liveaboard Sailing Community. We didn't go to Cuba, but many, many of the other internationals we
Yes.
did. They said the American dollar was the currency in Havana, that and barter.
That has changed. Since from 1994 on.
Around 2000.
Yeah, exactly. From 1994 till about 2005, yeah. From about 1994 to 2005, the dollar was freely usable in Cuba. You could go and people would take dollars. Now you cannot do that. You have to, I guess it's like any other country in the world now, you have to trade your dollars for a Cuban special currency, okay, which is called the CUC, okay? The weird thing about Cuba is that it has two currencies, okay? It has one currency, the Cuban peso, which is what ordinary Cubans have. If they want to buy the CUC, they have to buy it using euros or dollars.
Like the hard currency store.
That's the hard currency. And with that hard currency, you can get anything you want. I mean, but you know, if you go to a Cuban hotel, you have to use hard currency. If you go to a Cuban store, restaurant, they'll take hard currency. Only kind of very simple, low-level, not a little bit, you know, very simple establishments will accept the Cuban pesos. Okay?
One other question.
Yes.
I can think that some lobbies in this country that are not Cuban, like our sugar lobby,
Right.
strong, could also be playing a role in this. Can you elaborate on that? Or what
Right.
other lobbies here might be fighting this foreign policy?
Okay. This is the key. Why doesn't U.S. policy change? Okay? Everybody knows our policy is absurd, okay? Bill Clinton knew that it was absurd. Barack Obama knows that it's absurd. I don't know that W ever got it. I think he thought our policy made sense. But most people, okay, in Washington believe that the policy is absurd. But it's all based on electoral politics. And here's how it works, okay? It's true that you have some American lobbies that want the embargo ended. Illinois, the farmers, okay, the U.S. farmers. This is fascinating. You see in the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, farmer lobbies, they want the policy ended. Why? Because here's the rationale. They say if the U.S. government allows U.S. citizens to go to Cuba, you're going to have, all kinds of estimates have been done, at least 2 million Americans going to Cuba every year. At least 2 million, okay? What are those Americans going to do in Cuba? Well, they're going to buy a lot of food. They're going to eat a lot. And some of the food they're going to eat in Cuba, Cuba is going to have to import from the United States. Because, and Cubans have told me this, they said, the best, cheapest food for us comes from the United States. You know, I remember having a conversation with a Cuban economist. He was saying, you know, Brazil, we have trade with Brazil, but their chicken, you know, we buy their chicken legs and their chicken meat. They said it's 69 cents a pound. We can get it from Arkansas for 49 cents. I mean, that's a big difference when you're talking about importing huge amounts of food. So that's the calculus. You get Americans to go to Cuba, Cuba's going to have to import more food. So the U.S. agricultural lobby will benefit. Okay, that's one side of it. The oil companies, they want to see some change, okay? One of the big stories, and it would be even bigger if you lived right next to Straits of Florida as opposed to next to Lake Michigan, is that if you look at that map, okay, if you look at that map, think of a huge triangle sticking up into the Gulf of Mexico, roughly this way, okay, up there, okay, huge triangle. Those are, okay, under international law, okay, and under the conventional law of the sea, each state gets 200 miles of an exclusive economic zone. Over those 200-mile zone, that 200-mile zone, a state regulates oil exploration, mining rights, fishing, okay? Now, there's a problem. Of course, if you look at the map, Mexico is here, okay? The United States there, Cuba is there. There are 200 exclusive economic zones all converge. They conflict, okay? So President Carter in 1979 got the United States, Mexico, and Cuba together. This was one of the things he did, very positively. And he said, okay, let's negotiate an agreement. So the three countries agreed, and they divvied up this, basically they divvied up the whole Gulf of Mexico into 3 zones. One for the U.S. exclusively, one for Mexico exclusively, and one for Cuba exclusively. And that's this triangle that I'm talking about. Okay? Well, there is evidence that there are huge amounts of oil and natural gas there. Okay? You just need to drill it. And who is interested in exploiting it? Well, the Chinese oil company, the Indian oil company, the Norwegian oil company, the Spanish oil company, Repsol, okay? All these foreign oil firms. Where is ExxonMobil? Where is Chevron? Okay, they can't because the US government doesn't allow them to, okay? Now, right now, you've got a couple of hardliners in Congress, okay, trying to please the Cuban-American lobby in Miami, and they want to have President Obama repeal this treaty, which he's not going to do. The next thing they want to do is they want to impose sanctions on any oil company around the world that does business with Cuba. I don't think that's going to go well, okay? Because if we start punishing their companies, other countries will start punishing ours, okay? But, okay, so the oil companies would like to be involved in Cuba, okay? Where is the force against trade with Cuba coming from? Okay, number one, the hardline Cuban Americans. Why do they matter, okay? Look, 10% of Cuba's population, close to 1 million people, fled after the Castro Revolution, okay? They were the most prosperous, some of them among the best educated people in the country. They were at the top of the middle class, and certainly the whole property owning elite fled Cuba, okay? A lot of them have very long memories, and a lot of them, you can understand why, are very bitter, okay? Some of them are still living, and their kids are still around, and their kids have very vivid memories. And it is a matter of vengeance, okay? They are obsessed with Castro. As long as Castro is alive, these people want to keep the embargo. Why? Because they are totally obsessed with Castro, okay?
Where's Marco Rubio?
Marco Rubio, he's a hardliner. The first thing he did, he just was elected to the Senate. And, you know, all my friends who are very Republican, I'm one of 2 or 3 moderate Republicans left in the United States. Tell people I'm moderate Republican, say, oh, yeah, we heard there were 2 or 3 left. But Marco Rubio, by the way, he doesn't know anything about Cuba. He grew up in a Cuban-American family. He grew up in Miami, was born in the United States, grew up in Miami. But his parents just poisoned him, you know, about how horrible this thing is and how you have to be always pro-embargo. And of course, he got a lot of money from the lobbies. What's the first thing he did when he got to the Senate? I was so disappointed because this is obviously a very intelligent young man, and he should know better. President Obama just relaxed the rules for Americans to travel to Cuba in groups, okay? One of the things President Obama said was, from now on, flights to Cuba don't need to be restricted to Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. Any international airport in the United States that has a U.S. Customs facility can handle flights to Cuba. So, you know, all of a sudden, you know, Chicago O'Hare, Tampa, Florida, etc. All these cities could handle flights to Cuba. The first thing Marco Rubio did when he got to the Senate is he has brought up a bill to ban any new airports from handling air traffic to state sponsors of terrorism. Okay? It so happens that Cuba is on the State Department list of state sponsors of terrorism. Any national security expert will tell you that that's ridiculous. Okay? The last time Cuba supported a guerrilla movement was in the late 1980s. Okay? Since 1991, Cuba has not supported a single guerrilla movement. Castro made a big speech in 1991. He said, times have changed. Okay? But we keep Cuba on that list of state sponsors of terrorism for political reasons. And so that what Marco Rubio wants to do is keep flights to Cuba, to Miami, New York, and LA, banking on the fact that that will make it just more difficult for Americans to go. So it's endless. It's always the same way. It doesn't change. Yes, ma'am, back there.
Just one more, and then I think we better.
Quick question.
Yeah, I promise you this will not be a Castro speech. I won't keep you. In the old days, you know, he would give speeches for 2.5 hours.
Does Cuba have a middle class, and do they have a wealthy class? And if they have a wealthy class, where does that class make its money?
Okay. Cuba has a small group of, I mean, Cuba, you know, Cuba is based officially on the notion of equality, but it's not a country of equality, okay? You have a lot of very poor people, but credibly, I mean, you can say the poor people in Cuba, they get basic food rations, and they're able to buy just the basic necessities. They get basic housing, they get free education, and they get free basic health care, okay? So there's a floor, okay? And yeah, yes, you know, you can go and say the hospitals are dilapidated and there are no sheets and no towels, but they get the basic necessities taken care of. And yes, there isn't a whole lot of food for them to buy, but they don't suffer from hunger, okay? All right, so you got that large group of people. Then you have a middle class of sorts, small middle class, and these are people who have access to foreign currency, to dollars or euros. And with that, then they can buy their CUC currency and they can live better, okay? And they can do all kinds of things. I mean, for example, they can start a paladar, a small family restaurant. Cubans are so entrepreneurial, you know. That's why I'm optimistic over the long run. I knew a man in Havana. Listen to this, okay? He lived in a big apartment building, okay? And he had friends from the United States. This is why trade with the U.S. would be so good for them, okay? He had friends in the United States smuggle pieces, and he put together a satellite dish, okay? Kind of your regular Universal TV, you know, the one that you get 400 cable stations from. And he set it up very discreetly in his apartment, in one of the walls, in an alley, okay? He got all kinds of nifty TV stations. And then he started selling subscriptions to his neighbors. And said, now here's the deal, you know, you pay me $5 a month and you get access. Don't tell anybody, because if you do, guess what? You'll stop getting the cable service. He made quite a bit of money doing that, okay? So you got this people that are that way who manage to do rather well by Cuban standards, okay? Then you have a very small elite that lives much better, and they're basically very senior members of the Communist Party, athletes, and stars, okay? Could be dancing stars, ballet stars, okay? Big athletes, not just professional baseball players, but people that win gold medals overseas, actors, people like that, okay? That small elite lives very well, but you know, it's nothing like here. I mean, it's nothing like you see in the North Shore. So the inequalities are not as huge. Now, the inequalities will increase to the extent that Cuba's economy starts growing and becomes more of a market economy. And I don't think Cubans would mind that as long as everybody is better off, okay? So anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed this very quick introduction to Cuba, and above all, I hope that you find a way to get there and just do a lot of listening, and you will find that it's a very interesting time to go there, because Cuba will change. It's no longer a matter of whether it will change, and I think over the next 5 to 6 years we're going to start seeing that change accelerate. And my only wish were that we, the United States, as a very powerful country, could be playing a much more positive role than we are, and one that we definitely would be capable of playing. Thank you.
Thank you very, very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.
We're glad you came.